Malcolm Daniels adjusted his tie as he walked through Denver International Airport, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. The polished leather of his shoes tapped softly against the tiled floor, blending into the constant hum of rolling luggage wheels, flight announcements, and casual conversations. His tailored Navy suit helped him blend in with the crowd of business travelers, yet it gave him the freedom to act quickly if needed. Years of experience as an undercover FBI agent had taught him that everything, even the smallest detail, mattered. Today, however, he felt a subtle unease. Something about this mission, this flight, felt different. As his sharp eyes scanned the sea of faces, he instinctively cataloged every detail. A man in a wrinkled suit argued too loudly on his phone, drawing annoyed glances from those nearby. A young family struggled with overstuffed carry-ons while their toddler wailed uncontrollably. Each was unremarkable in their own way. But then there were the outliers. A woman in first class wearing sunglasses inside the cabin, her posture too rigid to be natural. A sweating man clutching a scuffed briefcase as though it held his life savings. These anomalies tugged at Malcolm's attention, though he betrayed no outward sign of interest. The gate attendant smiled warmly as she scanned his boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice cheerful but professional. Malcolm nodded and thanked her, but as he moved toward the jetway, he couldn't shake the sensation that her gaze lingered on him just a moment too long. The feeling settled into the back of his mind like a thorn, small but persistent. Boarding the plane, he was greeted by a petite flight attendant whose auburn hair was pulled back into a perfectly neat chignon. Her name tag read, Heather Peterson. She wore the bright smile of someone used to diffusing passengers' complaints with charm and efficiency. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone as polished as her appearance. "Thank you," Malcolm replied, his tone equally smooth. Yet he noticed something. Her grip on the safety card in her hands tightened slightly as her eyes met his. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her expression, something that didn't belong. Before he could linger on it, she moved down the aisle with brisk, purposeful steps, her heels clicking softly against the cabin floor. Malcolm walked toward his seat, his senses sharpened. As he passed row 14, his eyes landed briefly on the sweating man. His hands gripped the handle of a weathered briefcase with a force that turned his knuckles white. Beads of perspiration dotted his brow despite the cool cabin air. He glanced around nervously, his eyes darting to the galley and back to the briefcase. A few rows ahead, the woman in sunglasses sat stiffly, her body language calculated, as though she had rehearsed every move. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the armrests of her seat, and her head turned only slightly when the other passengers filed by. Reaching seat 17D, Malcolm carefully placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him, positioning it so he could feel its presence against his feet at all times. The hard drive inside was the reason he was here, the reason this flight mattered. Settling into his seat, he loosened his tie slightly to appear at ease, though every fiber of his being remained on high alert. From this position, he could keep an eye on both the galley and the suspicious passengers nearby. Heather passed him again, her steps measured and her expression neutral. But her eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, landed on him for a split second too long before moving on. Malcolm's instincts flared. She wasn't just observing passengers. She was observing him. He was certain of it now. The realization sent a faint ripple of tension through him, though his face remained impassive. As the plane's engines roared to life and it began its taxi down the runway, Malcolm's unease grew. He watched as Heather conducted the safety demonstration. Her hands moved with practiced precision, gesturing toward seatbelts and oxygen masks, but her eyes betrayed her. She scanned the cabin with a vigilance that didn't match her otherwise calm demeanor. When her gaze landed on the sweating man in 14C, Malcolm noticed the faintest tightening of her jaw. She was watching him too. The plane lifted off smoothly, and passengers settled into the quiet routines of flight. Heather emerged from the galley a few minutes later, pushing a drink cart down the aisle. Her smile was back, warm and professional, but Malcolm could see the tension beneath it. She stopped at row 14, leaning slightly toward the sweating man as she handed him a cup of coffee with what appeared to be genuine politeness. Then, the accident. With a seemingly careless tilt of her hand, the coffee spilled onto his lap. The man yelped, his voice sharp with pain and surprise. Heather apologized profusely, her voice rising above the hum of the cabin. "Oh my goodness, sir, I'm so sorry. Let me help you clean that up." She reached for napkins, her movements flustered but deliberate. Malcolm observed intently. The man waved her off, his voice tight. "It's fine, really." But his body betrayed him. He hunched protectively over the briefcase, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted its position. Heather's tone remained light as she asked him casual questions, where he was traveling, how long his trip would be. The man's answers were short and evasive, his eyes darting to the galley. Heather returned to the galley, her posture composed, but Malcolm didn't miss the flicker of frustration in her expression. From his seat, he quietly examined his briefcase, running his fingers along its surface. That's when he felt it, a tiny bump near the seam. His pulse quickened. He pressed the spot lightly, confirming his suspicion. It was a tracker, no larger than a coin. His jaw tightened. Heather had marked him. But why? And for whom? Malcolm leaned back in his seat, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. He had encountered trackers before, but this one felt personal, crafted to blend seamlessly, planted with expert precision. His years of training warned him against acting rashly. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. The flight had barely begun, and he needed to understand what he was up against. Heather reappeared in the aisle, her movements fluid and efficient as she served other passengers. From the corner of his eye, Malcolm tracked her every step. Her posture was impeccable, her smile warm, but he noted the faint tension in her shoulders. Her hand occasionally brushed the pocket of her uniform, as if checking something inside. A signal receiver? Malcolm guessed. She wasn't just marking targets, she was monitoring them. The plane settled into its cruising altitude, and passengers relaxed into the monotony of the flight. The man in 14C had stopped fidgeting, though his grip on the briefcase remained tight. The woman in sunglasses still hadn't moved, her rigid posture almost unnerving. Malcolm decided it was time to make his own move. He stood slowly, stretching as if to ease the stiffness of travel, and made his way toward the restroom. As he passed the man in 14C, he noticed the briefcase slightly ajar. A glimpse of its contents confirmed his suspicions. Neatly stacked papers interspersed with thin wires. A makeshift device? He filed the observation away, careful not to let his curiosity linger too long. Returning to his seat, he found Heather glancing in his direction. Her smile was still in place, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. She knew he was onto her. The faint crease between her brows told him she was recalculating, adapting her plan. Malcolm resumed his seat, but not before making a subtle adjustment. In a smooth, practiced motion, he transferred the tracker from his briefcase to the carry-on bag of a middle-aged man engrossed in his tablet. The passenger didn't notice, nor did Heather, whose focus was momentarily elsewhere. Satisfied, Malcolm leaned back, his demeanor calm and detached. Heather's hand brushed her pocket again, and he saw her expression change. She glanced toward the tracker's new location, her confusion evident. Malcolm hid his satisfaction behind a mask of indifference. She had lost her mark, and her next move would reveal more than she intended. Moments later, Heather moved down the aisle, her pace slightly faster than before. She stopped at a row several seats ahead, her eyes scanning the luggage overhead. Her hand hovered near the bins, her fingers hesitating as if debating whether to open them. The middle-aged man stood abruptly, retrieving his bag as he prepared to head to the restroom. Heather froze, her smile faltering for just a second. Malcolm noted her reaction. She was thrown off, her carefully laid plans unraveling. As Heather returned to the galley, Malcolm allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had disrupted her operation, but he knew it wasn't over. Whatever her mission, she wouldn't stop now. He had to stay one step ahead. Heather's movements had grown sharper, less fluid, as she returned to the galley. She glanced at her pocket device again, and Malcolm caught the faintest twitch of irritation. Whatever signal she was following had shifted, and it was clear she was recalibrating her strategy. Malcolm remained outwardly relaxed, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the armrest, but his mind worked furiously. He needed more information, more context to piece together who she was and what she wanted. The cabin atmosphere grew tense, though most passengers remained oblivious. Malcolm, however, noted the subtle changes. A second flight attendant, a young woman with sandy blonde hair, approached his row. Her posture was casual, her smile bright as she refilled his water. But as she leaned forward, she slipped a folded napkin onto his tray table. It was seamless. No one else would have noticed. She moved on without breaking stride, continuing her rounds. Malcolm waited a moment before unfolding the note, pretending to adjust his tie. The message was brief, written in hurried, neat handwriting. "She knows who you are. Be careful." His jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. He glanced toward the back galley where the second flight attendant stood, her back turned as she rearranged trays. Malcolm recognized the warning for what it was, a confirmation that Heather was more than just a flight attendant, and he wasn't the only one aware of the stakes. Heather emerged again, her smile back in place but her eyes scanning the cabin with a predator's focus. She lingered briefly near the man in 14C, then moved toward first class, her posture still stiff. Malcolm noticed the moment her gaze landed on him. It was a fleeting look, but enough to confirm her suspicions hadn't dissipated. She was regrouping. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, Malcolm reviewed the facts. Heather's behavior, the tracker, the man in 14C, and now the cryptic note, it all pointed to something larger. Nexus. The word rose unbidden in his mind. The organization was a ghost in intelligence circles, a shadowy network that operated outside the bounds of law or morality. If Heather was connected to them, this mission was more dangerous than he had anticipated. The woman in sunglasses shifted slightly in her seat, drawing his attention. For the first time, she lowered her glasses, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that scanned the cabin before resting briefly on Malcolm. Their gazes met, and her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. Malcolm's unease deepened. There was no coincidence here. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting passengers in their seats. A chorus of nervous murmurs filled the cabin, but Malcolm remained still, his senses heightened. Heather used the momentary chaos to slip toward his row. She leaned down, her tone laced with forced authority. "Sir," she said softly, "I need to speak with you about tampering with airline property." Malcolm tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Excuse me?" Heather's eyes locked onto his. Her voice dropped further, meant only for him. "You've been moving through the cabin inappropriately. I need you to come with me." Malcolm held her gaze, his face impassive. "That's quite an accusation. Are you sure you want to make it?" For a moment, Heather's mask slipped. The tension in her jaw, the faint tremor in her hand gripping the seat back. It was all there. Malcolm stood slowly, his movements deliberate. As he followed her toward the galley, the weight of his briefcase against his leg reminded him of what was at stake. Once they reached the confined space of the galley, Heather's demeanor changed. The professional smile dropped entirely, replaced by cold determination. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "I know what you're carrying, and I know who you are. Hand it over." Malcolm's hand brushed the counter as he leaned slightly forward, his expression calm but deadly serious. "If you know who I am, then you know how this ends if you make the wrong move." Heather hesitated, her composure cracking. The silence between them stretched taut as the hum of the engines pressed against their words. Heather's lips pressed into a thin line as she weighed her options. The small galley felt suffocating, its metallic surfaces reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hand hovered near her apron pocket, where Malcolm guessed she was concealing something, likely a weapon or device. His stance remained steady, one hand casually resting on the counter, the other ready to strike if needed. "You don't understand," Heather said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't about you. It's bigger than you. If you cooperate, maybe you'll walk off this plane alive." Malcolm's expression didn't falter. "I've heard that line before. It never ends well for the person saying it." Heather's composure broke for a split second, her mask slipping to reveal the fear beneath. Her pupils dilated, her breathing quickened. She wasn't just playing a role. She was in over her head. Whatever her mission, she wasn't as in control as she wanted him to believe. "Tell me," Malcolm said, his voice a low growl. "Who sent you? Nexus? What are you after?" Heather's eyes darted to the curtain separating them from the cabin. She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. If I don't complete this mission, they'll come for my family. They've already shown me what they can do." Malcolm studied her, the raw fear in her voice matching the desperation in her eyes. Nexus was infamous for coercing their operatives with threats, often targeting their loved ones. He'd seen it before, agents forced to choose between their mission and their humanity. Still, her fear didn't absolve her. She was dangerous, and lives were at stake. "You have one chance to walk away from this," Malcolm said, his tone firm but measured. "Help me take them down, and I'll make sure your family is protected." Heather let out a shaky breath, her resolve faltering. "You can't protect them. Nexus has people everywhere. They never send just one agent." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. The man in 14C, the woman in sunglasses. Anyone on this flight could be a Nexus operative. The cabin was no longer just a plane, it was a battlefield. "Then help me find them," Malcolm said. "Give me names, faces. We take them down together or we both go down." Heather's shoulders sagged as the weight of her situation pressed down on her. She glanced toward the cabin again, as if expecting someone to burst through the curtain at any moment. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "There's a man in row 16, gray jacket. He's one of them. But there could be more." Malcolm's mind raced. Row 16 was close. Too close. The man she described hadn't drawn his attention before, which meant he was either a master of blending in or had been waiting for the right moment to act. Either way, it was a threat he couldn't ignore. "You keep doing your job," Malcolm instructed. "Act normal. If anyone signals you, report it to me immediately. Understood?" Heather hesitated, then nodded. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron and adjusted her hair, trying to regain the polished composure of a flight attendant. As she stepped back into the cabin, her movements were stiff but controlled. Malcolm followed a moment later, his eyes scanning the rows with renewed vigilance. The man in 16C sat quietly, his gray jacket unremarkable. He was reading a magazine, his posture relaxed. But Malcolm knew better than to trust appearances. Heather returned to her routine, moving through the cabin with forced ease. She served drinks, smiled at passengers, and answered questions, but Malcolm could see the tension in her shoulders. She avoided eye contact with him, but gave the briefest nod when she passed by, signaling that nothing had changed. Yet. The man in 16C shifted slightly, reaching into the seat pocket in front of him. Malcolm's muscles tensed, ready to act. But the man simply pulled out a pen and jotted something on the margin of his magazine. A subtle movement, but one that set Malcolm's instincts on edge. Was it a signal? A message? He needed more information. The woman in sunglasses suddenly stood, her movements deliberate as she made her way to the restroom. Malcolm's eyes followed her, noting the way she glanced subtly toward row 16 as she passed. A signal of her own? Heather approached Malcolm's row again, this time leaning in as she pretended to adjust the air vent above his seat. "She's one of them," Heather murmured, her lips barely moving. "The woman in first class." Malcolm nodded slightly, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one of chaos. He needed to act before Nexus operatives coordinated their next move. Malcolm sat back in his seat, though every nerve in his body was taut with anticipation. The woman in sunglasses disappeared into the restroom, but he kept his gaze fixed on the reflective edge of the compartment door. Subtle movements from row 16 caught his attention. The man in the gray jacket shifted slightly, his hands slipping under his tray table. To most, it might seem like a casual adjustment, but Malcolm recognized it as a practiced move, deliberate and precise. Heather continued down the aisle, interacting with passengers, her outward demeanor calm. But Malcolm noticed the fleeting glances she threw toward the gray-jacketed man and the restroom. She was tracking the players in this silent, dangerous game, and every action seemed to add another layer of tension to the cabin. The plane jolted slightly as turbulence rocked the fuselage. Nervous murmurs rippled through the passengers, and Malcolm used the distraction to make his move. He stood slowly, stretching as if to ease cramped muscles, and walked toward the galley. As he passed the gray-jacketed man, he noted the way his fingers tensed around the edge of his tray. Malcolm feigned indifference, stopping near the restroom and waiting, his posture relaxed, but his mind on high alert. The restroom door opened and the woman in sunglasses emerged, her expression composed but her steps purposeful. Malcolm caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes when she saw him standing there. She quickly masked it with a polite nod before moving past him, heading back to first class. Malcolm followed her movements closely, noting how she adjusted her bag strap. A signal, no doubt. As he returned to his seat, his attention shifted back to the man in gray. The passenger was no longer reading his magazine, but staring straight ahead, his body tense. Malcolm's instincts told him that the time to act was fast approaching. The longer he waited, the more likely Nexus operatives would synchronize their plans. Heather passed by again, her tray now empty. As she leaned toward Malcolm, she murmured under her breath, "They're coordinating something. Watch the overhead bins." Malcolm nodded imperceptibly and began subtly observing the bins around row 16 in first class. The tension in the cabin was growing, palpable to anyone who was paying attention. Most passengers remained blissfully unaware, chatting with seatmates or watching in-flight entertainment, but Malcolm's trained eye caught the small tells. Shifting glances, the quick adjustment of a bag strap, a finger tapping out an anxious rhythm on an armrest. Then it happened. The man in gray jacket stood suddenly, causing the passenger in the adjacent seat to look up in surprise. He reached for the overhead bin, and in one swift motion, he retrieved a small, inconspicuous duffel bag. Malcolm's eyes narrowed as the man began walking toward the galley. Heather intercepted him, her tone professional but firm. "Sir, please return to your seat until the seatbelt sign is off." The man froze for a moment, his body language stiff. "It's important," he said, his voice steady but devoid of the usual annoyance such a request might provoke. Heather didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, sir, but regulations require—" Her words were cut short as the man shoved her aside with surprising force, sending her stumbling into a row of seats. Gasps erupted from the surrounding passengers, and the cabin erupted into chaos. Malcolm was already moving, his instincts taking over as he surged toward the man. The gray-jacketed operative unzipped the duffel bag, revealing a device wired with flashing lights. It wasn't immediately clear what its purpose was, but Malcolm knew better than to wait to find out. He reached the man just as he was about to activate the device, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. The man let out a grunt of pain, but his grip on the device remained firm. Passengers screamed and ducked as Malcolm wrestled with the operative, the aisle too narrow for large movements. The man's elbow jabbed into Malcolm's ribs, but he didn't loosen his grip. With a calculated move, Malcolm shifted his weight, slamming the operative into the side of the galley. The device slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. Heather, recovering quickly, kicked the device toward the back of the galley, her face pale but determined. "Do you know how to disarm that?" she shouted, her voice tight with fear. "Not yet," Malcolm growled, pinning the operative against the wall. "But first, we need answers." The operative snarled, struggling against Malcolm's grip. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he hissed. Heather crouched near the device, her hands hovering over it as though afraid to touch it. "It's not just a bomb," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a signal disruptor. They're trying to block communications." Malcolm's mind raced. If Nexus was jamming communications, it wasn't just about the hard drive anymore. Whatever their plan was, it was escalating. The plane hit another bout of turbulence, throwing them all off balance. Malcolm tightened his grip on the operative, slamming him back into the galley wall. "How many others are on this plane?" he demanded. The man sneered but didn't answer. Malcolm pressed harder, his tone deadly. "Answer me, or I'll make sure you never leave this plane." The tension in the galley was suffocating. Heather's eyes darted between Malcolm and the device, her hands shaking. The cabin behind them was in disarray, passengers panicking and shouting. Time was running out, and Malcolm knew the next few moments would determine everything. Malcolm kept his grip firm on the woman in sunglasses as the cabin began to settle into an uneasy quiet. The restrained operatives, the disarmed device, and the passengers' wide-eyed fear painted a picture of how close the plane had come to disaster. Flight attendants moved among the rows, offering reassurances to those who were shaken, though their own hands trembled as they passed out water and blankets. The woman struggled against Malcolm's hold, her eyes burning with defiance. "You think you've stopped anything?" she hissed. "You're just a pawn, same as me." Heather, still slumped against the galley counter, looked up sharply. "What does she mean by that?" she asked, her voice weak but urgent. Malcolm tightened his jaw but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on the woman. "You'll explain what's happening, all of it, or I'll make sure Nexus doesn't find you useful anymore." The woman laughed bitterly. "Useful? Do you think they care about any of us? The second this mission fails, they'll erase every trace of us. Me, him, her." She nodded toward Heather, who flinched at the implication. "We're expendable, and so are you." "Not today," Malcolm said, his voice cold and resolute. He motioned for Heather to stand, and she hesitated before stepping closer. "Check her bag," he instructed. Heather's hands trembled as she opened the woman's bag. Inside, she found another small device, sleek, black, and unfamiliar. "It's not a bomb," Heather murmured, turning it over in her hands. "It's some kind of data transmitter." "Backup," Malcolm muttered. They had more than one plan in place. He took the device from Heather and slipped it into his own briefcase. "We're handing this over to the authorities when we land." The woman in sunglasses sneered. "You think you've won because you stopped us on this flight? Nexus doesn't lose. You've only delayed the inevitable." Malcolm ignored her, turning his attention back to Heather. "You said there might be more agents on board. Did you notice anyone else acting suspiciously?" Heather shook her head, her eyes scanning the cabin nervously. "No one else stood out, but if they're trained like me, they'd be hard to spot unless they made a move." Malcolm considered this, his mind working quickly. "We need to secure the cabin and maintain control until we land. Any other attempts could come from someone unexpected. Stay alert." Heather nodded, though she looked far from confident. She moved back into the cabin to assist the other flight attendants, her eyes darting constantly to every passenger. Malcolm dragged the woman in sunglasses toward the rear galley, where he secured her wrists with a pair of zip ties provided by a flight attendant. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin grew heavier. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, informing passengers of the situation and assuring them that law enforcement would be waiting upon arrival. Malcolm appreciated the professionalism, though he knew the next phase would be just as dangerous. If Nexus had agents on the ground, the danger wouldn't end when the wheels touched down. When the plane landed, the chaos erupted anew. Law enforcement officers swarmed the cabin, escorting the restrained operatives off the plane and immediately securing the disarmed device and transmitter. Malcolm handed over the tracker and relayed everything he knew to the agents on the ground. His experience with Nexus meant he'd be part of the debriefing, but his focus remained on Heather. She stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The exhaustion on her face was evident, but so was the fear. Malcolm approached her, his voice low. "They'll want to question you too. Be honest, but don't volunteer more than you have to. You're not their target. Yet." Heather nodded slowly. What happens to my family? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Malcolm met her gaze. I'll make sure they're protected. Nexus won't get to them, but you need to help us take them down. Tears welled in Heather's eyes, but she nodded again, this time with more determination. I'll do whatever it takes. As the last passengers disembarked, Malcolm stepped off the plane, his briefcase securely in hand. The fight against Nexus wasn't over. It never was. But for today, the threat had been neutralized. He knew the battle ahead would be long and dangerous, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop until Nexus was dismantled, piece by piece. Sarah met the operative's questioning gaze in the dimly lit galley, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her breathing. The narrow space felt stifling, the air thick with tension. There's been a complication, she whispered, her voice so low it barely carried over the hum of the engines. What kind of complication? The man asked, his tone clipped and distrustful. He shifted slightly, his posture coiled, ready for action. Before Sarah could respond, Malcolm emerged from the shadows, moving with the silent precision of a predator. In a fluid motion, he wrapped an arm around the operative's neck, applying pressure to the carotid arteries. The man's eyes widened in surprise as he clawed at Malcolm's arm, his movements frantic. Sarah pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling a gasp as she watched the struggle unfold. The operative's thrashing grew weaker as his consciousness faded. In a gravelly whisper, his final words escaped his lips. The plane will never land safely. His body went limp in Malcolm's hold, and the agent gently lowered him to the floor. Sarah stared, her face pale, as the weight of the man's words sank in. Malcolm's expression remained composed, but the sharp intensity in his eyes betrayed his understanding of the danger they were now in. The faint click of the cockpit door opening snapped Malcolm's focus forward. The co-pilot stepped out, scanning the cabin with a deliberate and overly measured gaze. Malcolm noticed the way the man's shoulders were rigid, his eyes flickering from passenger to passenger with unsettling precision. Something was wrong. The co-pilot's surveillance lasted only a moment before he disappeared back into the cockpit. Almost immediately, the plane jolted violently, the turbulence rattling overhead bins and sending unsecured items skidding across surfaces. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign punctuated the growing unease in the cabin. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot's hands moved swiftly over the navigation system, bypassing security protocols with expert precision. One by one, he altered the plane's flight path, redirecting it from its intended destination. His grim smile betrayed a sinister satisfaction as he adjusted the cabin's air pressure controls, knowing the chaos it would cause. In the cabin, oxygen masks dropped from the overhead panels, eliciting gasps and cries of panic. Flight attendants hurried to reassure passengers and secure loose objects as the plane bucked and swayed. A child's wail pierced the air, adding to the cacophony. Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward the galley, gripping the overhead bins for balance as the plane trembled. He found Sarah clutching a service cart, her knuckles white. "What do you know about the crew?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes darting toward the cockpit. She hesitated, then suddenly remembered. "The co-pilot," she said, her voice trembling. "He wasn't on the original roster. He was added last minute." Malcolm's expression darkened. "That's all I needed to know," he muttered, his mind racing to connect the dots. In the cockpit, the co-pilot raised a secure satellite phone to his ear. "Phase 1 is complete," he said in a hushed tone. "Flight path is compromised." He reached for the door's locking mechanism, engaging additional barriers to ensure no one could enter. As the plane lurched again, he manipulated the controls further, setting the stage for total chaos. Malcolm leaned against the galley wall, his mind racing as the plane shuddered around him. The co-pilot's behavior, the masked systems, and the ominous threat from the unconscious operative all pointed to one conclusion: this was no ordinary hijacking. He turned to Sarah, whose face was tight with fear but determined. "They're not just after the hard drive," Sarah whispered, the realization dawning on her. They're trying to take control of the entire plane. Malcolm gave her a sharp nod. And they're doing it from the cockpit. The plane jolted again, the turbulence worsening. Passengers gripped their seats as oxygen masks swung wildly above their heads. Sarah steadied herself against the service cart as a flood of memories from earlier came rushing back. "The passenger in 14C," she said suddenly. "When I spilled the coffee, he didn't act normal. He wasn't upset about his clothes or his notebook. He was protecting that briefcase." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "A carrier," he said, the term loaded with implication. "Nexus uses unwitting couriers. They don't know what they're transporting, just that they can't let it go." "We need to see what's inside," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. Malcolm adjusted his jacket, his expression hardening. "Let's move." The two made their way down the aisle, the chaos in the cabin masking their approach. Solomon, the nervous man in 14C, sat rigidly in his seat, one hand gripping the briefcase like a lifeline. Sweat poured down his face as he stared straight ahead, muttering under his breath. "Sir," Malcolm said in a low, commanding tone, flashing his FBI credentials as he stopped beside the man's seat. "I need to inspect your briefcase." Solomon's knuckles turned white around the handle. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice shaky. Sarah stepped forward, her voice soothing but firm. "Sir, we're offering a complimentary upgrade to premium economy. It's a more comfortable seat for the rest of your flight." Solomon hesitated, torn between his natural inclination to obey and his orders to guard the briefcase. After a tense pause, he stood shakily, clutching the briefcase like a lifeline. Malcolm smoothly took the briefcase as Sarah led Solomon to a new seat. Returning to the galley, Malcolm set the case on the counter and examined it with methodical precision. His trained fingers worked the lock swiftly, and the case opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled among innocuous documents, was a compact but sophisticated explosive device. Sarah's face turned ashen at the sight. "It's Nexus tech," she said, pointing to the distinctive mechanisms. "See the timer? It's altitude sensitive. Even if we disarm it now, it'll detonate during descent." Malcolm nodded grimly. "We'll disarm it anyway." His hands moved with precise, practiced motions as Sarah guided him through the disarming process, her knowledge of Nexus engineering proving invaluable. "Cut the blue wire first," Sarah instructed, her voice steady despite the stakes. "The red connects to the altitude sensor. If you touch it before the others, we're finished." Malcolm's fingers hovered over the wires, the tension thick in the air. With deliberate care, he severed the blue wire, then the green. Finally, he snipped the red. The device powered down with a soft whine, and both he and Sarah exhaled deeply. "Good work," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. Malcolm secured the diffused bomb in a locked compartment, but his expression remained tense. "This isn't over," he said. "The cockpit's compromised, and we have no idea how far Nexus's influence reaches." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "What's the plan?" Before Malcolm could answer, a chilling laugh echoed from the corner of the galley. The restrained operative, now conscious, sneered up at them. "You're wasting your time," he spat. "She's still one of us. Always has been." Malcolm's gaze snapped to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. His hand drifted instinctively toward the concealed weapon at his side. "No," Sarah exclaimed, her voice breaking. "I've done everything you've asked, Malcolm. I risked everything to help you." Malcolm's eyes searched hers, scanning for the subtle tells he'd learned to recognize in his years of interrogation. The trembling in her hands, the tears streaming down her face, the raw emotion in her voice, it all felt genuine. Yet the stakes were too high for misplaced trust. "Then explain the tracker," Malcolm said, his tone hard. "The knife." Sarah's shoulders sagged. "I told you, they have my family. Everything I did because they forced me, but I'm here now risking my life to stop them." The operative on the floor snickered. "Manipulation is what the Nexus does best. You'll see." Malcolm silenced him with a sharp glare, then turned back to Sarah. After a long, tense moment, he lowered his weapon. "You get one more chance," he said. "Don't make me regret it." Sarah nodded fervently, determination lighting her eyes. "I won't." Malcolm's decision lingered heavily in the air as he and Sarah worked in the tight confines of the galley. The disarmed bomb sat secured in a compartment, but the weight of the larger threat loomed over them like a storm cloud. The plane jolted again, drawing panicked cries from the cabin. Malcolm handed Sarah an earpiece. "Stay connected. If anything changes, I need to know immediately." Sarah nodded, slipping the device into her ear as she kept glancing nervously toward the cockpit. "If the co-pilot's controlling the flight path, he's the key to shutting this down." "Agreed," Malcolm said. "But it's more than him. If Nexus compromised the flight crew, there's no telling how many layers of this plan we've missed." Sarah's face tightened. "We need to stop the signal," she said, pulling up a decrypted communication file on her tablet. "It's being transmitted from someone on the ground. They're actively feeding commands to the co-pilot." Malcolm's earpiece crackled with an incoming transmission from the FBI office. "Agent Payne, we've traced the signal. It's coming from Los Angeles International. We're coordinating with airport security, but Nexus likely has operatives planted." Malcolm cursed under his breath. "Get a team on it. Send me the location of the signal's source." The reply was crisp. "Already done. It's originating near baggage operations. Stand by for updates." As Malcolm relayed this information to Sarah, Mia's voice broke through their link. "I've stabilized the wiring," she said from the rear galley, her tone strained but steady. "The secondary detonator won't trigger, but it's clear there's another mechanism, something remote." Sarah glanced at Malcolm. "That signal, we have to stop it before we land." Malcolm nodded, his expression hardening. "We will." The captain's voice came over the intercom, the calm veneer barely masking his stress. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing at Los Angeles International. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for descent." The cabin erupted in murmurs and gasps, and the tension rippled through the rows of passengers. Malcolm looked to Sarah. "Stay close. If things go south, I need you ready." The descent was turbulent, both in the air and within the cabin. Passengers clutched their armrests as the plane shuddered through the skies. Sarah moved carefully through the aisle, her practiced smile back in place as she reassured passengers, though her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. Malcolm stayed near the galley, his body tense as he prepared for any last-minute interference. His earpiece crackled again, this time with the voice of the FBI field team leader. "Agent Payne, we have visual on a suspect in baggage operations, moving in now." "Be careful," Malcolm replied. "If they're Nexus, they're trained to bait you into overreaching." The agent's voice came back firm. "Understood." The plane jolted as the landing gear deployed. From the window, the lights of LAX came into view, the runway flanked by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Malcolm's heart pounded as he scanned the cabin one last time, his hand brushing the concealed weapon at his side. The plane touched down with a hard, jarring impact. Tires screeched against the tarmac, and passengers screamed as the force threw some forward in their seats. The pilots wrestled for control, finally bringing the aircraft to a screeching halt. Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt and moved quickly, signaling Sarah to follow. "Let's get the passengers off first," he said. "We'll handle the rest." Outside, the scene was chaos. FBI agents swarmed the tarmac, weapons drawn as they moved to secure the area. The plane's emergency slides deployed, and passengers hurriedly evacuated, some weeping, others clutching their belongings in disbelief. Inside the airport, the FBI team closed in on the source of the signal. Their suspect, dressed as a baggage handler, was cornered near a maintenance corridor. As agents surrounded him, he reached for a small transmitter clipped to his belt. "Drop it," an agent shouted, his weapon trained on the man. The suspect hesitated, his fingers brushing the device. Before he could make a move, a sharp crack echoed through the corridor, a warning shot fired into the concrete floor. The man froze, his hands raised. "Secure the device," the lead agent ordered, and another officer quickly retrieved the transmitter. Back on the plane, Malcolm and Sarah watched the final passengers descend the emergency slides. Malcolm's earpiece buzzed with an update. Suspect is in custody. Transmitter secured. No additional signals detected. Malcolm exhaled deeply, relief briefly crossing his face. Good work, he said into the comm. Get that device to HQ. We'll need a full debrief. Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. Is it over? Malcolm shook his head. For now. But Nexus doesn't stop. This is just one layer of the fight. Malcolm watched as the last of the passengers reached the tarmac, their faces etched with fear and relief. The lights of emergency vehicles cast flickering shadows across the scene, and the air buzzed with activity. FBI agents moved swiftly to secure the plane, their weapons drawn as they swept through the cabin for any remaining threats. Sarah stood at Malcolm's side, her breathing uneven. What happens now? She asked, her voice low. We secure what we can, regroup, and prepare for the next move, Malcolm replied, his tone steady but firm. He gestured toward the secured briefcase containing the disarmed bomb. That's evidence Nexus won't want falling into our hands. We'll need to move fast. An agent approached them, his face grim. Agent Payne, we've received confirmation. The transmitter's signal has been neutralized. The suspect in baggage operations has been taken into custody, but there's something else. Malcolm's brow furrowed. What is it? The agent handed him a tablet displaying intercepted communications from the transmitter. The messages were short but chilling. Phoenix Protocol is active. Contingency measures in place. Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he read the words. This wasn't their endgame, he muttered. This was a distraction. Sarah leaned in, scanning the screen. If this was meant to draw attention here, what's their real target? Good question, Malcolm said. He turned to the agent. Get this intel back to HQ. Have the analysts cross-reference it with everything we pulled from the hard drive. I want answers, fast. The agent nodded and hurried away, leaving Malcolm and Sarah alone for a moment. The weight of the situation pressed down on them, but there was no time to dwell on it. Sarah, Malcolm said, his voice quieter now. You've been in their world. What do you think Phoenix Protocol means? Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting as she tried to piece together what she knew. It's a term I've heard before, she admitted. It's used for operations that involve high-risk, high-reward tactics. Nexus only activates it when they're willing to sacrifice assets to achieve a major objective. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Which means whatever they're planning is already in motion. Inside the bustling FBI command center at LAX, analysts worked feverishly to decode the newly intercepted communications. Streams of data filled the screens as agents coordinated with field teams across the city. Malcolm and Sarah entered the room, their presence drawing immediate attention. Agent Carter approached, her expression as stern as ever. Payne, we've got a lead, she said, pointing to a map displayed on the central monitor. The transmitter's last active signal wasn't just controlling the plane. It was also syncing with a secondary device, something embedded in the city's infrastructure. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of infrastructure? The electrical grid, Carter replied grimly. If Nexus takes it down, the blackout could affect millions. They'd plunge the city into chaos. Malcolm's mind raced. Do we know where the device is? Carter gestured to another agent who brought up an overlay of Los Angeles. We've narrowed it to a substation near downtown, the agent explained. But there's more. The messages mention a secondary team already in place. They're protecting it, Malcolm said, or ensuring it detonates if anyone gets too close. Carter nodded. We've dispatched a tactical team, but we'll need someone with Nexus intel on site to identify the device and disarm it. Sarah stepped forward, her expression resolute. I'll go. Malcolm glanced at her, his face unreadable. Are you sure? Sarah met his gaze, determination hardening her voice. If Nexus succeeds, everything we've done here today will mean nothing. I can help. Let me. Malcolm studied her for a moment before nodding. All right. but you'll follow my lead. No heroics." Carter motioned to the waiting SUVs outside. "Move fast. We don't know how much time we have." The tactical convoy sped through the streets of Los Angeles, weaving through traffic with sirens blaring. Malcolm sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the cityscape as he mentally prepared for what lay ahead. Sarah sat beside him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. "What should I expect?" she asked, breaking the tense silence. "Nexus likes redundancy," Malcolm said. "The substation will be rigged to blow if anyone interferes. They'll have operatives on site, possibly disguised as workers. If things go south, stay close and let me handle it." Sarah nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Understood." As the convoy approached the substation, the scene came into view, a sprawling complex of transformers and wires, its perimeter guarded by chain-link fencing. Tactical agents disembarked, fanning out to secure the area. Malcolm and Sarah followed, their movements swift and deliberate. Malcolm gestured to a lead agent. "Any visual on the team?" "Not yet," the agent replied, scanning the perimeter with binoculars. "But there's definitely activity inside." "Then we move in," Malcolm said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Inside the substation, the air buzzed with the low hum of electricity. Shadows moved among the towering machinery, and Malcolm's sharp eyes caught the faint glint of a weapon. He signaled to the team, and they advanced silently, their weapons at the ready. Sarah stayed close to Malcolm, her heart pounding as they navigated the labyrinth of equipment. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed ahead, and Malcolm raised a hand, motioning for the team to stop. He peered around the corner, spotting two operatives crouched near a device mounted on one of the transformers. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "That's the detonation mechanism." Malcolm nodded, signaling for the team to take positions. With a swift motion, he and the agents converged on the operatives, who reacted instantly, drawing weapons and opening fire. The substation erupted into chaos as bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces. Malcolm moved with precision, his shots taking down one operative while the team subdued the other. Sarah ducked behind a console, her heart racing as she watched the firefight unfold. "Sarah," Malcolm called, "the device." She scrambled toward the mechanism, her hands trembling as she examined its intricate wiring. It was more sophisticated than anything she'd seen before, but she forced herself to focus. Malcolm held his position, covering her as more Nexus operatives emerged from the shadows. "Can you disarm it?" he shouted over the din. "I'm trying," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concentration. She carefully traced the wires, her training and instincts guiding her. "This red wire connects to the failsafe. If I cut it wrong, then don't cut it wrong," Malcolm barked, firing another shot. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's fingers hovered over the wires. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and made the cut. The device powered down with a sharp beep, the lights on its panel flickering off. Sarah exhaled in relief, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "It's done," she called out. Malcolm took down the last operative and turned to her, his expression a mix of relief and pride. "Good work," he said, extending a hand to help her up. As the tactical team secured the area and swept for additional threats, Malcolm and Sarah stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them. In the distance, the city lights flickered, their steady glow a testament to what had been saved. "You did it," Malcolm said quietly. "We did it," Sarah corrected, her voice firm. Malcolm nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "This is just the beginning. Nexus won't stop. Neither will we." The FBI convoy arrived at the outskirts of the sprawling substation, a labyrinth of transformers, steel towers, and snaking cables. The area was dimly lit by flickering floodlights, casting eerie shadows across the gravel and cracked asphalt. The perimeter was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, the faint hum of electricity filling the air like an ominous background score. Malcolm stepped out of the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the area with the precision of a hawk. Years of experience told him this was no ordinary setup. The quiet was too perfect, the angles of visibility too convenient for ambushes. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a trap. Sarah climbed out of the vehicle behind him, her movements steady but betraying the weight of nerves pressing down on her. An agent handed her a lightweight tactical vest, and she pulled it on with fumbling hands. The vest felt heavier than it should have, the symbolic burden of the mission pressing down harder than the actual gear. Malcolm turned to her and adjusted the straps on her vest, his hands quick and efficient. "Remember," he said, his voice low and firm. "No impulsive moves. You're here because we need your intel. Leave the rest to me." Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. "Got it. I won't do anything stupid." Malcolm's gaze lingered on her for a moment, reading the tension in her posture. Then he turned to the team. "Move out. Secure the perimeter. No one gets in or out without my say." The agents moved into formation, their weapons drawn as they advanced on the substation. The hum of the transformers grew louder the closer they got, the smell of ozone hanging heavy in the cool night air. Sarah followed Malcolm closely, her heart pounding as she tried to keep up with the agent's deliberate, calculated movements. As they reached the fence, one of the agents clipped the chain with bolt cutters, creating a narrow gap. Malcolm went first, slipping through with the grace of a seasoned operative. Sarah hesitated for only a second before following, ducking through the opening and into the shadows of the substation. Inside, the towering machinery loomed overhead, the maze of equipment creating pockets of darkness and blind spots. Malcolm signaled for the team to spread out, his hand gestures sharp and precise. Sarah stayed close, her eyes darting nervously as she tried to keep track of her surroundings. "See anything?" Malcolm whispered to the agent on point. The agent shook his head, his voice barely audible. "Not yet, but there's movement near the central transformer." Malcolm nodded, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Let's get a closer look. Stay sharp." They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the gravel. As they rounded a corner, Malcolm spotted two figures crouched near a large transformer. The faint glow of a control panel illuminated their faces, operatives, clearly trained, working quickly on a device mounted to the machinery. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her breath catching. "That's the secondary detonator." Malcolm studied the scene, his mind working fast. The operatives were focused on their task, their movements practiced and efficient. One of them glanced up briefly, his eyes scanning the area, and Malcolm pulled Sarah back into the shadows. "We'll hit them hard and fast," Malcolm said, signaling to the team. "No room for mistakes." Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the console they hid behind. "What if they've already armed it?" she whispered. "Then you'll disarm it," Malcolm replied simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Before Sarah could respond, Malcolm gave the signal. The team moved in like a coiled spring released, their weapons drawn as they closed in on the operatives. One of the operatives turned, his hand going for a weapon, but Malcolm was faster. A single shot rang out, hitting the man in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. The second operative bolted, disappearing into the maze of equipment. "Go," Malcolm barked, and two agents gave chase while the rest secured the area. "Sarah," Malcolm called, pointing to the device. "It's all yours." Sarah hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot as her mind raced. Then she forced herself forward, dropping to her knees in front of the device. Her hands trembled as she examined the tangle of wires and circuits. "It's more advanced than the one on the plane," she muttered, her voice tight. "There's a secondary failsafe connected to—" "Then figure it out," Malcolm snapped, firing another shot as the first operative tried to reach for his weapon. Sarah forced herself to focus. The hum of the transformers seemed louder now, pressing against her eardrums as she traced the wires with her fingers. "Red wire, blue wire, green circuit," she muttered under her breath. "If I cut the wrong one—" "You won't," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "You can do this." Sweat dripped down Sarah's face as she reached for the red wire. Her fingers trembled and she clenched her jaw, forcing herself to steady her hand. With a deep breath, she made the cut. The device emitted a sharp beep, then fell silent. The lights on the panel blinked off, and Sarah sat back on her heels, her breath escaping in a shaky exhale. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm moved to her side, his eyes scanning the deactivated device. "Good work," he said, helping her to her feet. "Now let's make sure there aren't any more surprises." Back at the FBI command center, the team reviewed the intel recovered from the substation. Screens lit up with decrypted messages, maps, and schematics, all painting a chilling picture of Nexus's next moves. "This wasn't their only operation," Malcolm said, his voice heavy with conviction. "Phoenix Protocol is bigger than just this one city." Sarah stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the scrolling data. "Then we'll stop it," she said, her voice firm. "All of it." Malcolm glanced at her, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "You're in this now, for real." "I know," Sarah said. "And I'm ready." The hum of the command center buzzed around them, a backdrop to their shared determination. Nexus had been dealt a blow, but the war was far from over. Together, they were ready for whatever came next. The FBI command center buzzed with controlled chaos as agents worked feverishly to piece together the threads of Nexus's sprawling operation. Decrypted messages, surveillance footage, and intercepted communications scrolled across the screens. The weight of the uncovered network was staggering. Malcolm stood in the middle of the room, his injured hand wrapped tightly but forgotten as he reviewed the latest intelligence with Sarah by his side. Agent Carter approached, her expression grim but focused. "We've triangulated the remaining active nodes," she said, gesturing toward the map displayed on the central monitor. Red dots blinked ominously over major cities. "They're spread across multiple locations. Nexus isn't just targeting infrastructure, they're going after critical systems nationwide. Power grids, communications hubs, even transportation control centers." Malcolm's eyes scanned the map, his jaw tightening. "This wasn't just about chaos," he said. "They're destabilizing foundations. They want to cripple the country's ability to respond." Sarah leaned in, her fingers brushing against the edge of the desk. "If we focus on the remaining nodes, we might be able to neutralize them before they go active. But the coordination required—" She trailed off, her voice edged with worry. "We'll handle it," Malcolm said firmly, turning to Carter. "What's the status of the arrested Nexus operatives?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Most are refusing to cooperate, but we've managed to extract some critical intel from the one at the substation." He confirmed there's a central Nexus command hub coordinating these attacks. Malcolm's gaze sharpened. "Where?" Carter hesitated. They were careful. "It's mobile, an unmarked vessel off the coast, moving constantly to avoid detection. Satellite imagery picked up an unusual pattern near Catalina Island that matches their activity." Sarah's stomach churned. "A floating command center. That explains how they're staying ahead of us." Malcolm nodded grimly. "Then we take it out. Carter, get me a strike team. If we can disable that hub, we cut off their ability to coordinate these attacks." Carter nodded. "I'll have the team ready within the hour." The next phase of the operation unfolded quickly. A strike team was assembled, their gear loaded into transport helicopters waiting on the tarmac. Sarah watched from the sidelines as agents checked weapons, secured equipment, and reviewed tactical maps. She felt a strange pull. Part of her wanted to stay behind, to let the professionals handle what came next. But another part of her, the part that had faced death aboard the plane and disarmed a bomb under impossible pressure, knew she had a role to play. Malcolm approached her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to come," he said. "This is going to get dangerous." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "You need someone who knows how Nexus thinks," she said. "I'm coming." Malcolm studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then stay close. This isn't a solo mission." The helicopters roared to life, their blades cutting through the night air as the strike team boarded. Sarah took a deep breath as she followed Malcolm into one of the aircraft, her heart racing as they lifted off. The city lights of Los Angeles faded into the distance, replaced by the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The target vessel came into view just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. It was a sleek, modern ship, bristling with antennas and satellite dishes, an unmistakable command hub. From their vantage point, Malcolm could see figures moving on the deck, their movements sharp and methodical. "Lookouts," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rotors. "They're expecting trouble." The lead pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "We'll deploy you close, but stealth is critical. You've got one shot at this." Malcolm glanced at Sarah, who was seated across from him, her hands gripping the straps of her harness. "You ready?" She nodded, though her stomach twisted with nerves. "Ready." The helicopters hovered low as the strike team rappelled onto the deck of the vessel. Malcolm landed first, his weapon drawn as he swept the area. Sarah followed, her steps careful but determined. The team moved quickly, securing the deck and neutralizing the lookouts before they could raise the alarm. Inside the ship, the corridors were narrow and dimly lit, the hum of servers and machinery filling the air. Malcolm led the way, his every movement precise as he scanned for traps. Sarah stayed close, her eyes darting nervously as they advanced deeper into the command center. They reached the central operations room, a high-tech hub filled with monitors displaying live feeds of Nexus operations. 2 operatives sat at consoles, their hands frozen over keyboards as they turned to face the intruders. Malcolm's team acted swiftly, disarming and restraining the operatives before they could react. Sarah moved to the nearest console, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she worked to access the system. "They're running a live coordination program," she said. "If I can shut it down?" "No," Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp. "If we shut it down, we lose the chance to trace their remaining networks. Can you reroute it?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try." The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah worked, the screens flickering with lines of code. Outside, the sound of gunfire echoed through the ship as the strike team held off reinforcements. Malcolm stayed close, his weapon trained on the doorway. "Hurry," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Almost there," Sarah replied, her breath quickening. "If I can piggyback their signal, we'll have a real-time map of their entire network." A deafening crash shook the room as a grenade detonated somewhere nearby. The lights flickered, and Sarah let out a cry of frustration. "The system's destabilizing!" "Do what you can," Malcolm shouted, moving to cover her as Nexus operatives pushed closer. With a final keystroke, Sarah shouted, "Got it!" The monitors lit up with a sprawling map of connections, locations, and encrypted communications. "It's all here." Malcolm nodded. "Download it. We're pulling out." As Sarah scrambled to extract the data, Malcolm fired a burst of rounds into the corridor, buying them precious seconds. The strike team fell back into the room, their movements coordinated as they secured the perimeter. "Extraction's inbound," the team leader called out. "We need to move." Sarah yanked the drive from the console and nodded to Malcolm. Together, they pushed through the chaos, fighting their way back to the deck. The helicopters hovered overhead, ropes dropping as the team ascended one by one. Sarah clung to Malcolm's side as they boarded the chopper, the roar of the rotors drowning out the gunfire below. As the ship faded into the distance, Sarah slumped back in her seat, the drive clutched tightly in her hand. She turned to Malcolm, her face pale but determined. "We have everything," she said. "This could dismantle Nexus for good." Malcolm nodded, his expression serious. "Then let's finish this." The helicopter soared over the Pacific, the chaos of the operation fading behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and determination. Sarah clutched the hard drive, her knuckles white as she stared at it, fully aware of the weight it carried. Malcolm sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, already thinking about their next steps. The comms crackled to life, Agent Carter's voice cutting through. "Do you have it?" Malcolm responded firmly. "We've got the drive." "Nexus's command hub is compromised." A pause, then Carter replied with a hint of relief. "Good work. Bring it in. We'll start decrypting immediately." Back at the FBI command center, the tension was palpable as Malcolm and Sarah arrived with the hard drive. Analysts and agents scrambled to set up secure decryption stations. Carter greeted them at the entrance, her usually stern expression softened by a flicker of pride. "You've done more in one day than we've managed in months," she said, taking the drive from Sarah. "If what's on here is as comprehensive as you say, we might finally have the tools to dismantle Nexus." "It's all there," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "Their networks, operations, personnel, everything. But they'll know we have it. They won't go down without a fight." "We're ready for that fight," Carter assured her. The drive was connected to the secure system, and within moments, streams of data began flooding the screens. Malcolm and Sarah stood at the center of the bustling room, watching as years of Nexus's secrets were laid bare. Financial transactions, encrypted communications, safe house locations, all of it was there. An analyst called out, "We've identified major hubs in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Each one is linked to high-level operatives." Carter turned to Malcolm. "We'll coordinate simultaneous raids. With this information, we can cripple their infrastructure." Hours later, as the task force mobilized, Malcolm found Sarah sitting in a quiet corner of the command center. She looked up as he approached, exhaustion etched into her features. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," he said, his tone softer than usual. Sarah offered a faint smile. "I couldn't just stand by and let them win. Not after everything they've taken from me." "You've given us the chance to stop them for good," Malcolm said. "But this isn't over. You'll need to stay in protection until we're certain Nexus can't retaliate." Sarah nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I understand. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" Malcolm asked. "Finish this," she said, her voice firm. "Don't let them come back." Malcolm's expression hardened. "I won't." The raids were swift and precise. Across the country, Nexus operatives were taken into custody, their facilities dismantled. The data from the drive proved invaluable, uncovering not only their immediate operations, but also their long-term strategies and key leadership. At the heart of the FBI's efforts, Malcolm worked tirelessly, coordinating teams, reviewing intel, and ensuring no detail was missed. The days blurred together, but the progress was undeniable. Nexus was crumbling, their once impenetrable network collapsing under the weight of its own exposure. Weeks later, Sarah stood in a safe house in an undisclosed location, watching a news broadcast. The screen displayed images of arrested Nexus leaders, seized assets, and decommissioned operations. The reporter's voice was clear. "What was once believed to be an untouchable shadow organization has been brought to its knees, thanks to the coordinated efforts of federal agencies." A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Malcolm, his expression tired but triumphant. "You did it," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "We did it," Malcolm corrected. "This wouldn't have been possible without you." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Is it really over?" Malcolm leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "Nexus is finished as we know it, but people like them don't disappear completely. There will always be others." Sarah nodded. "Then I guess we keep fighting." Malcolm smiled faintly. "You've got the heart for it. And if you ever decide you want to do more than just hide, we could use someone like you." She smiled back. "I'll think about it." As Malcolm turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Thank you. For everything." He nodded once. "Stay safe, Sarah." The Nexus operation marked the end of one battle, but the beginning of a larger war. As the world adjusted to the fallout, Malcolm returned to his work, knowing that vigilance was the only way to prevent the rise of another shadow organization. For Sarah, the experience was transformative. She found strength she didn't know she had, and though her journey wasn't over, she faced the future with a renewed sense of purpose. Nexus had tried to break her, but instead, they had forged her into something stronger. The fight against darkness continued, but for now there was light.